And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we want to take a look at yet another example of the short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And excuse me, so let's get right to it. On this example, my real-world event is going to be the invention of the personal computer, of the PC, of the personal computer. And so the invention of the personal computer, we have to then ask ourselves, is my real-world event, is that going to change the aggregate demand curve, or is that going to change the short-run aggregate supply curve? So you have to go back and look at your determinants for aggregate demand, which we talked about on a previous video, and your determinants for short-run aggregate supply, which we talked about on a previous video. I'm going to argue that this is going to be a short-run aggregate supply determinant. You could go through those short-run aggregate supply determinants. It would be a change in wage rates, change in non-labor costs, productivity, and supply shock. I'm going to argue that the determinant here is going to be productivity. So the invention of the PC, and really what I mean by this is kind of the mass use of the PC begins sometime in the probably the late 80s, I guess, into the 80s, which then overflows into the productivity miracle in the 90s. The invention of the PC, we get, at least the argument could go, that we get an increase in productivity as a result of that increase in productivity. People become more productive at work. One worker turns out more outputs than they did before as a result of having these machines available, and so there's an increase in productivity, and that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve out to the right. That will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve out to the right. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts out to the right, and when it does, if we produce more stuff and have more goods and services, then that's just like any regular old supply curve, really. If you increase the supply of goods and services, then the price of those goods and services are going to naturally get bid down. So the prices are going to get bid down in the economy. So we're going to say this, my aggregate supply story is going to be increased productivity. If we have an increase in productivity, then we said that's going to mean that there's more production. That's going to increase production, obviously, increase in the gross domestic product, and then that's going to cause prices to decline. That's going to cause prices to decline as you have more goods and services. But then what happens on the aggregate demand side? As prices begin to decline, we're going to move along the aggregate demand curve. We're going to move along the aggregate demand curve as prices decline. And there's really three stories that I could tell here. I'm just going to tell the first one right now, and that's going to be the wealth effect. So as we get a decrease in prices, that's going to cause my real wealth to increase. We talked about this on the previous podcast where we talked about moving along the aggregate demand curve. If prices go down, my real wealth is going to rise, and if my real wealth rises, then I'm going to be able to engage in more consumption, and that's going to move me along the aggregate demand curve. I'm going to get an increase in consumption right here. And then, of course, there's also, this is just the wealth effect. There were three of these. There was the wealth effect to move us along the aggregate demand curve. There was the interest rate effect that we talked about. As prices go down, people don't need as much money to buy their normal goods and services, so they can save more, and that'll cause interest rates to go down, and that'll cause investment to go up. So the wealth effect causes an increase in consumption. The interest rate effect causes an increase in investment. And then finally there was the international trade effect. And the international trade effect said if prices go down in the United States, our goods become cheaper than the rest of the world. More people buy our stuff. That means increased exports. That means increase in net exports. That's an increase in net exports. So this movement along the aggregate demand curve is because of an increased consumption, increased investment, increased net exports. Either way, it's going to move us along the aggregate demand curve. So notice, as there's an increase in productivity, there's going to be an increase in production. Gross domestic product is going to rise, but there also has to be, obviously, remember, this is three things. This is income, production, and spending. So if production goes up, spending must go up as well. Why does spending go up? Because of the lower prices, wealth effect, interest rate effect, international trade effect. The lower prices cause an increase in consumption, an increase in investment, an increase in net exports. That's an increase in spending right there. So let's finish this off. What happens by the end of this process is prices are going to go down. Let's see, we're going to get an increase in the gross domestic product, and unemployment, therefore, is going to decline. And this is probably the best of all worlds when you get these increases in productivity and that short run aggregate supply curve is shifting out to the right, and you get a decrease in the price level and an increase in GDP and decrease in unemployment. Like, most people like most of these things, okay? Most people like most of these things. So we really like when we can get that short run aggregate supply curve shifting out to the right. All right, this has been another podcast with Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.